we've just seen a couple of examples of inquiry-based labs, and they looked fairly different. They targeted different student populations, were different in scope, required different levels of resources. What then defines an inquiry-based approach to lab instruction? Well, in 2000, the National Research Council published Inquiry and the National Science Education Standards, a guide for teaching and learning. And in that, they indicated that in inquiry-based processes, students engage in many of the same activities and thinking processes as scientists. What then are these activities and thinking processes? What is it that scientists do? Well, multiple policy documents published over decades, including those from the National Research Council and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, indicate that scientists ask questions, they propose hypotheses and models, they design, carry out, and analyze studies to evaluate those hypotheses and models. They communicate the results and interpretations, and then they revise the results and interpretation in response to peer review. To help teachers think about how to incorporate these thinking processes and activities into an inquiry-based approach to lab, Gabriella Weaver, Keanan Russell, and Donald Wink proposed 7 elements of inquiry. These elements of inquiry are observing and questioning, designing experiments, collecting data, analyzing data, repeating, and reporting and responding to peer review. So these are the elements of inquiry that we want to think about when we're considering an inquiry-based approach to lab instruction. Let's think about how these can be incorporated. First, let's think a little bit about a traditional approach to lab instruction. In a traditional approach to lab instruction, students are doing some of the activities and thinking processes that we associate with what scientists do. But usually the focus is on collecting data and analyzing data. In inquiry-based labs, more of these elements of inquiry tend to be incorporated, but they do work on a continuum. Inquiry-based labs do exist on a continuum. At sort of its simplest level, an inquiry-based approach to lab instruction adds the element of designing experiments. That is, students have responsibility for designing the experiments in addition to collecting data and analyzing data. They have to choose what elements to keep constant, what elements to vary, what controls to do, put together the experiment that they're going to do in that lab. They may do this in response to an instructor-based question, but now they're incorporating this element of inquiry, this thinking process and this activity that scientists do. In other examples of inquiry-based labs, even more of the thinking processes and activities that scientists do are turned over to students. In some inquiry-based labs, the responsibility for asking an answerable research question is turned over to students. They make observations, they ask questions with guidance from their instructor, design an experiment to answer that question, then collect their data and analyze their data. In still other inquiry-based labs, even more of these thinking processes and activities of scientists are turned over to the students so that they may also repeat experiments and report the results to their peers. So if inquiry-based labs can exist along this continuum ranging from, just incorporating the experimental design, collecting data and analyzing data, all the way to incorporating all of these elements of inquiry, let's take a minute and think about which of these elements of inquiry we saw in the 2 examples that we looked at earlier. The astronomy lab example led by Erica Grunstrom and the biological sciences lab example led by Charles Sissom. First, let's think about that astronomy lab example. Which of these elements of inquiry were incorporated into that astronomy lab example? This is a choose all that apply question. So before you go on with the video, you'll need to choose which of these elements you think were incorporated into that example. The astronomy lab example incorporated most of these elements, but in limited and structured ways. So Erica Grundstrom structured her astronomy lab such that students had the opportunity to practice essentially all of these elements, to practice observing, questioning, designing experiments, collecting and analyzing data. And she gradually withdrew the support for the students such that by the end of the semester they could do all of these elements on their own. If you'll recall, what students did was on most weeks they would come in and they would become acquainted with a website to see what kinds of data what kinds of data it made available to them, and the kinds of questions that could be answered with that data. They would then practice the analysis element, evaluating statements to determine if they were supported by the evidence that could be gathered from that website. And then they would practice asking questions. They would ask a question, check it with Erica Grundstrom to make sure that it was answerable, and then they would go on and gather data, analyze it to answer that question. And so they had this very structured support for incorporating these elements, and it culminated the last lab of the semester with them coming in, choosing a website that they'd used earlier in the semester, asking a question that could be answered with data from that website, checking it with Erica, and then doing a small project that culminated in a report to their peers. Now, let's think about which of these elements were incorporated into the biological sciences lab example. Again, this is a choose all that apply question. You need to determine which of these elements you think were incorporated into the biological sciences lab example led by Charles Sissom before continuing the video. That biological sciences lab also incorporated all of these elements, again with support, and in the biological sciences example with iteration. So the students started the semester by making observations by reading papers that Charles Sissom had selected for them, and using the observations that they made from those papers to identify sort of an open research question in that particular area. And Charles would help guide them to think about whether their question was feasible, whether it was answerable. And he also helped them as a group of these 8 students designed experiments to answer that question. The students would go on and gather data, analyze data to try to answer their question, and at mid-semester they presented their results to their peers and the other instructors in the class so that they could get feedback, respond to it, adjust their project before going on to repeat and expand on their experiment to reach their final results. And as you'll remember, they reported their final results publicly to their peers, to the instructional staff in the course, and to all of the faculty in the biological sciences department. So that lab incorporated all of those elements, but it very consciously supported those different elements. So we've seen that inquiry-based labs can incorporate different elements of inquiry, from simple incarnations in which students are responsible for designing experiments to more elaborate incarnations where students ask their own questions, design experiments, collect and analyze data, and report the results publicly. Now, let's take a minute and let's think about the kinds of thinking that students are asked to do in inquiry-based labs. first, let's think about a relatively simple incarnation of an inquiry-based lab, where students are responsible for designing their own experiments, collecting data, and analyzing data, but they're not asking their own research questions, and they're not necessarily reporting the results publicly. So let's think about the kinds of thinking that we're asking students to do in this type of inquiry-based lab. One way to think about the types of thinking that we're asking students to do is to use Bloom's taxonomy, which you've seen earlier in this course. So let's think about which of Bloom's levels of learning can be achieved when students design experiments, collect, and analyze data. This is a choose all that apply question, so before you go on with the video, stop and think about which of these levels of learning can be achieved by students when they're designing experiments. Even in this relatively simple incarnation of an inquiry-based lab, where students are designing experiment, collecting and analyzing data, students are doing some fairly high levels of thinking. We're asking them to evaluate, to analyze, to apply, as well as to understand and remember. So when students design an experiment, they have to determine what's the best approach to answer a question. What variable should I hold constant? What am I going to vary? What controls should I do? After they design that experiment, which requires a significant amount of evaluation, they collect data, they analyze data, and then they have to go on and they have to evaluate again whether their results really can answer the question that they asked. And so they're having a lot of experience and support from the instructor in practicing these relatively high levels of thinking. Now, let's think about an approach to inquiry-based lab where students are incorporating even more of these elements of inquiry. Specifically, let's think about an inquiry-based lab in which students are asking their own research question as well as designing the experiment and carrying out the experiment. So in this case, I want you to think about which of Bloom's levels of learning is particularly emphasized when students define their own research question. So this is a choose the one best answer question. And I want you to think about that before going on with the video. When we turn over the responsibility for asking an answerable research question to our students, we're really giving them the opportunity to create, to synthesize different pieces of information, to come up with an interesting question. And so this type of inquiry-based lab really emphasizes this highest level of Bloom's taxonomy. Now, students are still having the opportunity to evaluate, to analyze. They're designing an experiment. They're analyzing data. They're evaluating the results to see if they answer the question. But by giving them the opportunity to ask that research question, we're really giving them the chance to synthesize observations and come up with something that feels like their very own, right? I want to emphasize that adding the element of reporting gives students even another opportunity to engage in this very high level of thinking, because when students need to report their project and their results to an audience that's not intimately familiar with it, they have to evaluate what it is they need to tell the audience, and they need to synthesize it into a coherent whole that their listeners can really understand. And so incorporating that public reporting element has very significant value for the students' thinking. So we've considered the types of thinking that students can do in an inquiry-based approach to lab instruction. And it's these thinking processes that are really essential to the students' learning. We'll return to this idea in a minute, but first let's take a minute and consider some different questions about an inquiry-based approach to labs. First, you may be wondering whether it's important that the questions that the students are asking are novel. As scientists, we're really trained to think that it's important that we ask novel questions and that we seek information that expands our knowledge base. Is it important in an inquiry-based lab for students to be doing just that? Well, the short answer is no. If we consider traditional labs, inquiry-based labs, and course-based undergraduate research on a continuum, students in traditional labs are never answering a novel question. They're always verifying known information. Students in a course-based undergraduate research experience, on the other hand, are always answering a novel question. Novelty is really an essential part of answering a research question in that type of approach. In inquiry-based labs, the questions that the students are answering are sometimes novel and sometimes have known answers. But what's really key is that the students don't know the answer, and they're designing an experiment to answer a question. They're not collecting data to verify a known truth. So in inquiry-based labs, the emphasis is really on the student learning rather than on gathering novel information. All right, so what sorts of benefits have been demonstrated for inquiry-based lab pedagogy? Well, there are really two types of benefits that have been demonstrated for inquiry-based labs. First, inquiry-based labs have been shown to lead to cognitive gains for students. That is, students have demonstrated increased content understanding and increased transferable skills like critical thinking, ability to design experiments, ability to analyze data. Secondly, inquiry-based labs have been shown to lead to affective gains, such as more positive attitudes about learning science and greater motivation for learning science. And these two types of benefits really get at what we want for our students. We want our students to love science, to love learning science, and to learn it really well in a way that they can use it later. And so an inquiry-based approach to lab instruction can help get our students where we really want them to be. Now, you may be wondering, does it always work? Sounds great. Are there any limitations to this approach? And of course there are. As with any teaching approach, implementation is really key. And with inquiry-based lab instruction, it's vital to include scaffolding and opportunities for practice to help students develop the needed thinking processes. What we're asking students to do in an inquiry-based lab is really challenging. We're asking them to evaluate different approaches to answering a question. We're asking them to synthesize observations to come up with a question and then, design a way to answer that question. These things are really quite challenging for students. And so if we don't include scaffolding and opportunities for students to practice these skills, then they don't necessarily achieve them. You'll notice that in the examples of inquiry-based labs that we looked at earlier, the astronomy lab example that Erica Grinstrom led, and the biological sciences example that Charles Sissom led, that there were multiple opportunities for students to practice and multiple types of support that were provided. Let's take a minute and consider some things that Erica and Charles have to say about how they provided this sort of support.
This is kind of a style that people have called backward faded scaffolding. So you provide a lot of support right away, and then you kind of gradually take away the supports over the course of one lab.
We had them as a checkpoint to how well they do in their experiments. We do a mid-semester presentation. The original goal was to do a pre-trial to kind of test proof of concept for the experiments they're designing. And the semester presentation is a reality check, as we call it, that, okay, now you must present your results. And for many students, it's the first time to also think about presenting publicly in a coherent fashion what they're doing, what they did, and how it relates to the real world.
So you'll note that Erica very consciously provided the sort of support that students needed to develop the skills for an inquiry-based lab using that backwards fated scaffolding approach that she described. Charles also very consciously provided support and structure for his students, helping point their research question in a particular direction, helping provide guidance for them as they developed that research question in their experimental plan, and incorporating an opportunity for them to do part of their project, get feedback from their peers and other instructors before then proceeding. So both Charles and Erica really illustrate how one can provide the sort of support that you need to make an inquiry-based approach to lab instruction successful. So, what are key elements to include when you're thinking about doing your own inquiry-based lab? Well, as we've already alluded to, it's really important to include instructor guidance to help students develop inquiry skills. As we've said, the kinds of thinking, the activities that we're asking students to do are really challenging, and so we need to provide support and guidance to help them define a research problem, to help them formulate hypotheses, to help them plan an experiment. We can't just toss them in and expect them to be able to do these challenging things without helping them figure out practice and learn how to do these things. It's also very important to include an opportunity for peer-to-peer interactions and teaching. Now, what this looks like can vary. So you can have multiple short interactions with peers where they work in pairs that change from week to week, or you can have more long-term collaborations, as we saw in the biological sciences example, where 8 peers work together throughout the course of the semester. You can also simply incorporate opportunities for the students to present to their peers and respond to their peers' feedback. So exactly what that peer-to-peer instruction and teaching looks like can vary, but it's very important to include that element. It's also important to include an opportunity for students to give a summative presentation of their work, either oral or written. As we talked about earlier, this opportunity to sort of synthesize a whole presentation of their work gives the students the opportunity to practice bringing elements together, evaluating what's important to talk about, and to present the types of analysis that they did. And so providing this opportunity helps solidify students' understanding of the whole process. What sorts of challenges can you expect when you're developing an inquiry-based lab? Well, they look a whole lot like the sorts of challenges you'll encounter in doing your own scientific research. You're almost certain to encounter messy data. You're almost certain to encounter unexpected results. And you're very likely, because you're dealing with novices, you're very likely to encounter questions that are too broad. In other words, you're likely to encounter a little bit of chaos. But by incorporating the sorts of structure and support that we've been talking about, you can help use this chaos in service of your students' learning. To help you deal with these challenges, you should rely on existing communities of scholars within your discipline who can help you avoid pitfalls, point you to good practices, and point you to really good existing examples of inquiry-based labs. To help you get started finding these communities of scholars, we've provided some resources in the PDF associated with this course. There are some general resources, and then there are some discipline-specific resources that may help you get started with inquiry-based labs within those disciplines. And These resources range all the way from astronomy through computer science, earth and environmental science, engineering through physics. In this PDF, we've also provided selected references so that if you want to do more reading to learn more about policy documents that define inquiry and its implementation and teaching, those references are available. If you want to read more about this definition of the elements of inquiry, those references are available. We've also provided selected references that demonstrate the benefits of inquiry-based lab instruction, and finally, selected references on general teaching and learning principles.